When developing and deploying a backend web application, we usually have to use different configurations for different environments, such as development, testing, staging, and production. Today we will learn how to use Viper to load configurations from file or environment variables. Reading values from file allows us to easily specify default configuration for local development and testing, while reading values from environment variables will help us override default settings when deploying our application to staging or productions using Docker containers. Viper is a very popular Golang package for this purpose. It can find, load, and unmarshal values from a config file. It supports many types of files such as JSON, TOM, YAML, and or INI. It can also read values from environment variables or command line flags. It gives us the ability to set or override default values. Moreover, if you prefer to store your settings in a remote system such as etcd or console, then you can use Viper to read data from them directly. It works for both unencrypted and encrypted values. One more interesting thing about Viper is it can watch for changes in config file and notify the application about it. We can also use Viper to save any config modification we made to the file. So that's a lot of useful features, right? In the current code of our Simple Bank project, we are hard-coding some constant for the DB driver and DB source in the main test.go file, and also one more constant for the server address in the main.go file. So in this tutorial, we will learn how to use Viper to read these configurations from file and environment variables. Okay, let's start by installing Viper. Open your browser and search for Golang Viper. Then open its GitHub page. Scroll down a bit. Copy this go-get command and run it in the terminal to install the package. After this, in the go.mod file of our project, we can see Viper has been added as a dependency. Now I'm going to create a new file, app.env, to store our config values for development. Then let's copy these variables from main.go file and paste them to this config file. Since we are using .env format, we must change the way we declare these variables. It should be similar to how we declare environment variables. Each variable should be declared on a separate line. The variable's name is uppercase and its words are separated by underscore. The variable's value is followed by the name after an equal symbol. And that's it. This app.env file is now containing the default configurations for our local development environment. Next, we will use Viper to load this config file. Let's create a new file, config.go, inside the util package. Then declare a new type, config struct, in this file. This config struct will hold all configuration variables of the application that we read from file or environment variables. For now, we only have 3 variables. First, the DB driver of type string. Second, the DB source, also of type string. And finally, the server address of type string as well. Alright, now in order to get the value of these variables and store them in this struct, we need to use the Unmarshaling feature of Viper. Viper uses a map structure package under the hood for unmarshaling values, so we should use a map structure tags to specify the name of each config field. In our case, we must use the exact name of each variable as being declared in the app.env. For example, the DB driver's tag name should be db_driver. The DB source tag name should be db_source. And similar for the server address should be server_address. Okay, next I'm going to define a new function, loadConfig, which takes a path as input and returns a config object or an error. This function will read configurations from a config file inside the path if it exists, or override their values with environment variables if they are provided. First, we call viper.addConfigPath to tell Viper the location of the config file. In this case, the location is given by the input path argument. Next, we call viper.setConfigName to tell Viper to look for a config file with this specific name. Our config file is app.env, so its name is app. We should also tell Viper the type of the config file, which is env in this case. You can also use JSON, XML, or any other format here if you want. Just make sure your config file has the correct format and extension. Now, besides reading configurations from file, we also want Viper to read values from environment variables. So we call viper.automaticEnv to tell Viper to automatically override values that it has read from config file with the values of the corresponding environment variables if they exist. Okay, so now we call viper.readInConfig to start reading config values. If error is not nil, then we simply return it. Otherwise, we call viper.unmarshal to unmarshal the values into the target config object. And finally, just return the config object and any error if it occurs. So basically, the load config function is completed. Now we can use it in the main.go file. Let's remove all of these hard-coded values. Then in the main function, let's call util.loadConfig and pass in dot here, which means the current folder, because our config file is in the same location with this main.go file. If there's an error, then we just write a fatal log saying cannot load configurations. Else, we just change this variable to config.db driver and config.db source. And the server address should be config.server address. And we're done. Let's try to run this server. It's working. The server is listening on port 8080, just like what we specify in the app.env file. Let's open Postman and send an API request. I'm gonna call this list account API. Oops, we've got a 500 internal server error. It's because our web server cannot connect to Postgres database on port 5432. Let's open the terminal and run docker ps to check if Postgres is running or not. There's no containers running. If we run docker ps-a, we can see that Postgres container has been exited. So we have to start it by running docker start Postgres 12. Okay, now the database is up and running. Let's go back to Postman and send the request again. This time it's successful. We've got a list of accounts here. So our code to load configurations from file is working well. Let's try overriding those configurations with environment variable. I will set the server address variable to localhost port 8081 before calling make server. Here we can see that the server is now listening on port 8081 instead of 8080 as before. If we try to send the same API request in Postman to port 8080, we'll get a connection refuse error. Only when we change this port to 8081, then the request will be successful. So we can conclude that Viper has successfully override the values it read from config file with environment variables. That's very convenient when we want to deploy our application to different environments, such as staging or production in the future. Now, before we finish, let's update the main test.go file to use the new load config function. First, remove these hard-coded constants. Then in the test main function, we call util.loadConfig. But this time, the main test.go file is inside the db/sqlc folder, while the app.env config file is at the root of the repository. So we must pass in this relative path. These two dots basically means that go to the parent folder. If error is not nil, then we just write a fatal log. Otherwise, we should change these two values to config.db driver and config.db source. And that's it, we are done. Let's run the whole package test. All passed. And that wraps up this lecture about reading configurations from file and environment variables. I highly recommend you to check out the documentation and try some other interesting features of Viper, such as live watching or reading from remote system. Happy coding and see you in the next lecture.